He balled his fists as he tried to steady his breath. Then he stepped forward, and her expression turned to one of fear as he towered over her with a menacing look on his face. "Luke," she said shakily, "please." Suddenly, it dawned on her that he was no longer the son of an influential family, so she had no reason to be afraid of him. The more she thought about it, Luke, in his current situation, probably had an even lower status than she did. Luke's anger burst out of him like a torrent. "If it wasn't for you, we never would have ended up in this mess," he yelled. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her slightly, wanting her to understand the gravity of the situation. Charlotte looked at Matthew, her eyes wide with fear. Although Matthew had no intention of attacking her, there was no denying she had offended someone she couldn't afford to. Everything was finally starting to make sense for Charlotte. Piece by piece, it all slotted into place. "Mr. Ford must be a real big shot," she thought. "He came to the gathering by bus to keep a low profile, and Phil and Estelle are treating him with respect. There's no other explanation for it." Charlotte pulled her arms out of Luke's grip, and then she dashed over to Matthew and looked up at him with a pleading expression. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Ford," she said despairingly. "If there's anything I can do for you, just say it. If it's within my power, you can have it. Please just let me go." Charlotte knew she had to admit to her mistake. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. Besides, another idea had occurred to her. She knew that her looks attracted many men, and few could resist her. If she could get Matthew interested in her, then not only would she escape punishment, but her status would naturally rise. An icy smile spread across Matthew's face. He couldn't deny that Charlotte was the type of person he disliked the most. He was a happily married man, and yet, even if he didn't have a lovely wife like Mia, he couldn't imagine being enticed by Charlotte's blatant grab for power. For someone who considered herself a smart woman, she was incredibly transparent, and Matthew just couldn't see her appeal. Matthew ignored Charlotte and her pathetic apology, and he walked purposefully toward William Rodney. "I think I deserve an explanation," Matthew said firmly. "And make it believable, or I can't guarantee your family will live to see another day." William's face turned pale. He had thought he had planned the evening out meticulously, but apparently he had underestimated Matthew's ability to see through his ploy. He smiled, trying to gloss over any awkwardness. "Mr. Ford," he said, "I'm really not sure I understand what you mean." Matthew's expression grew dark. "Come now," Matthew said, raising an eyebrow. "You know exactly what I mean." William opened and closed his mouth as he considered what to say, and Matthew brought his fist down hard on the metal table next to him. The onlookers jumped and gasped at the sudden noise. When they looked at the table again, They saw that Matthew had created a considerable dent in it, and they were astounded that he had been able to cause so much damage with just his physical strength. They began to murmur among themselves. "I thought Mr. Ford was a guest of William's." "So did I. Can anyone explain why Matthew is so angry with William?" William was trying to be clever, but it backfired. You can't pull the wool over a big shot like Mr. Ford, and he should have known better than to try. William had invited Matthew to the gathering simply because he had wanted to use him to suppress his enemies. But Matthew had known what William was up to, and he hadn't taken kindly to being used like that. To Matthew, somebody needed to pay the price for what had happened, and it didn't matter if it was William or Luke. William was terrified. He knew Matthew was strong, but he hadn't realized to what extent, and he wondered if it was more than mere mortal strength. Suddenly, he understood what he had done wrong. If he had wanted to deal with the Hamiltons, he should have done so himself. It had been foolish to drag Matthew into it. "Please, Mr. Ford," he said, "you can still give our family a chance. From now on, our family will follow your lead." Although William was at the post-celestial stage, he knew he was no match for Matthew. Matthew scoffed as he looked at William's hopeful expression. "It's too late for you to try to save yourselves now, William," Matthew said, frowning at him. "This is the end for the Rodney family." Matthew let his words settle, and then he turned and left. The crowd cheered as they watched Matthew leave, as they had begun to view him with respect. It was obvious to them that the entire city of Portland was going to change once the Rodney family were no longer calling all the shots. Matthew had stripped the Rodney family of their power over Portland, without even a shred of mercy. The only possible successor was the Hamilton family, but under the circumstances, they couldn't even protect themselves, so controlling an entire city would be impossible for them. Everyone thought that the chaotic situation Portland would find itself in might open up some new opportunities for some of the smaller families. They figured that with nobody to stop them, it would be their chance to discover their true strength and rise to the top on their own. Matthew left with a ferocious expression on his face. He considered himself to be a very magnanimous man, but he drew the line with his generosity when someone wanted to use his abilities to suppress others. When he returned home, he was pleasantly surprised to see Mia dressed unusually flirtatiously. But when Mia saw his distressed expression, she grew concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked, rushing to hug him. "I was starting to wonder if you were ever coming home." Matthew shook his head and sighed. "Oh, I just had to take care of 2 of the top families in Portland," he said, forcing a smile. Mia didn't like the sound of that, and she looked at Matthew quizzically. "What do you mean?" Mia asked, not exactly sure she wanted to know the answer. He was speaking as though dealing with powerful families was as simple as clicking his fingers. and the mere idea of that was astonishing. The more she got to know Matthew, the more mysterious she found him. She suspected he must have been seriously important for much longer than she had realized. Not for the first time in their marriage, Mia began to question his true status and whether she really knew him at all. She felt like she hadn't even scraped the surface. Matthew's mood seemed exceptionally low, and Mia didn't think it was only his recent activities that were playing on his mind. Meanwhile, Matthew felt uneasy. He had a bad feeling that there were about to be some major changes in Portland, and he was worried that they would exceed the scope of his abilities. It was as if the entire city had just been handed an extraordinary power, and although such people couldn't compare with him, it still made him a little anxious. His mood wasn't helped by the people from the celestial realm, who had been appearing more and more frequently in the mortal realm, filling Matthew with an ever-growing sense of danger. It prickled his nerves, as he feared the world might never be the same again. Standing by a window, he looked into the distance. He could feel a powerful aura swirling in the air above, and it filled him with apprehension. Matthew didn't know to whom the aura belonged, but the force of the energy he was feeling would suggest it belonged to someone from a secret part of the celestial realm, and that made him question just what plans they had in store for the world. When Matthew awoke the following morning, the unease he had felt the previous evening still lingered. As he was about to leave the house, he almost collided with William, who was standing on the doorstep, his finger poised to ring the bell. William looked anxious, and he licked his lips nervously as he prepared to speak. "Good morning, Mr. Ford," he said as calmly as he possibly could. "I've come to beg for your forgiveness, and I'm willing to pay for my mistakes. Just please give me one more chance, and I'll do anything you say. And if you can't forgive me, then at least forgive my family. I couldn't live with myself if I caused the demise of the entire Rodney family." He dropped his gaze to the floor, unable to look at Matthew. Just then, Lester stepped onto the porch beside William, and Matthew was surprised to see him there. Although Lester had a reputation for being an idiot, Matthew knew the man's energy was incredibly powerful. Matthew had helped Lester heal from the chaotic repercussions he had experienced when he had used a rare transcendence technique. With Matthew's assistance, Lester had reached the post-celestial stage, allowing him to control the power rushing through him. Although his abilities would be insignificant in the celestial realm, he did still carry a powerful energy within him. "Please, forgive our family," Lester begged. He had a lot of respect for Matthew and considered him a genius. Matthew frowned. He wasn't sure if he could forgive the Rodney family so easily for what they had done. But he thought for a moment, and then he said, "I'm prepared to forgive you on one condition. Remember how you once offered to serve me? Well, I would now like to take you up on that offer. If you do that, then I will overlook your family's wrongdoing." Lester's brows furrowed at Matthew's request. Although Matthew liked to think he played down his power and influence, Lester found him to be quite arrogant. Reluctantly, Lester nodded in agreement, knowing he had no other choice. "If you forgive my family," he said, sighing deeply, "then I will do anything you want me to." Matthew nodded, and he agreed he wouldn't pursue William or his family for their mistakes. Just as Matthew was about to dismiss them, a thought suddenly sprang into his mind. Lester was a mighty warrior of the celestial realm who had visited places that even Matthew hadn't been to. The previous evening, Matthew had sent a message to Orion in the celestial realm in a bid to gather information on the secret realm, but he was still awaiting a reply. He wondered if Lester had been to the secret realm, and whether he might be able to provide him with some answers. Matthew looked at Lester, a glimmer of hope in his eye. Matthew pulled Lester over to one side and quietly asked, "Have you ever been to the Land of Shadows? I've heard it's a very mysterious place." Although Matthew knew Lester had been to many places in the secret realm, he was doubtful he had been to the Land of Shadows. Even he hadn't been there, and he knew very little about it. However, as soon as Matthew mentioned the name, Lester's face turned pale. His reaction hadn't gone unnoticed, and Matthew tried to encourage him to speak. "You do know of it," he said, feeling a little nervous. "What can you tell me about it?" Lester took a moment to compose himself. "Mr. Ford," he said, an anxious edge to his voice, "the Land of Shadows is not a nice place." He looked around him as if to check if somebody was listening. Matthew watched Lester with great interest. It was clear that Lester knew exactly what kind of place the Land of Shadows was, and it made him fearful. "I've only ever heard of it," Matthew said, trying to sound casual. "So I don't know much about it. I just thought I'd ask." Lester had seen the unease flicker across Matthew's face, and he could hear the apprehension in his tone. There was almost nothing in the mortal world that fazed Matthew, so Lester was worried to see him acting in such a way. "I could tell you about it," Lester said in a hushed tone, "but I really don't think you'll like what you hear. The Land of Shadows is a place similar to the mortal realm's purgatory, and anyone who enters is highly unlikely to come out alive." He swallowed hard, and Matthew could tell he was well acquainted with the place, and he wondered how Lester knew so much about it. Matthew frowned and asked, "Do you know of a way we can contact the people in the Land of Shadows? There must be someone we can talk to." Lester took a step away from Matthew and tried to shut the conversation down. "I think you should give up on this matter," Lester said abruptly. "I did know of a friend in the Land of Shadows, but I don't know how I would contact him now. Look, I honestly believe you should forget all about that place. It's a lot more complicated than you may think." Matthew looked at Lester with mild surprise. It seemed he had underestimated the man, and he was confident there was a story waiting to be told. The tale appeared to be a distressing one, but Matthew needed some answers. "Please," Matthew said, "try your best. And in the meantime, I'll see if I can find another way to get information." Matthew's curiosity about the Land of Shadows had risen exponentially, and he was even more determined to discover what he could about it. Lester turned to leave, but Matthew grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Help me, Lester," Matthew said earnestly. "I need to find out what's going on." Lester gave Matthew a curt nod, and then he left with his grandfather. Just then, Matthew's phone rang. When he looked at the caller ID, he realized it was Jamie Cooper, one of his high school classmates. "Hey, Matthew," Jamie said when Matthew answered the call. "I just wanted to thank you again for giving my company the opportunity to work with the Diamond Group. If it wasn't for you, I really don't know what I would have done." Jamie had opened a small company in Portland, but it had been struggling to grow on its own. And when he had spoken to Matthew about it, Matthew had taken pity on him. Due to its inexperience, the Diamond Group would not usually entertain working with a struggling company. But Matthew had asked Mia to write up a temporary contract and cooperate with Jamie. That had helped Jamie's company immensely, and their development prospects were on the rise. Therefore, the Diamond Group might even consider working with them again in the future. "Are you going to our high school reunion tonight?" Jamie asked. "Oscar Rodriguez has arranged it. After signing the contract with the Diamond Group, there were some raw materials we needed to source, and Oscar's company is going to provide them. I've agreed to a long-term partnership with him, and I want to use tonight as an opportunity to thank him." He paused momentarily to take a breath before continuing. "Although, you're the one I should be thanking the most. If it wasn't for you, I would never have gotten the contract with the Diamond Group. I know it's normally impossible for a small company like mine to work with them." He paused again, and when Matthew didn't answer, he said, "Go on, say you'll come." Matthew frowned. As a rule, he didn't like reunions. The two he had been to with Mia hadn't ended well, so he had no intention of attending another one. "No, sorry," Matthew replied. "I have other plans, so I won't be going. I'm sure your company will do fine, but remember that the Diamond Group contract is only temporary, so you'll have to fend for yourself in the future. But if things go well, maybe the Diamond Group will take out a longer contract next time." Matthew took a moment to reflect on his memory of Oscar. He remembered his relationship with him hadn't been very good. Although they both came from rich families, there had always been a large divide between them. Their conflict hadn't been helped by the fact that they had once liked the same girl. However, such a problem no longer affected Matthew. After all, a dignified celestial divine lord wouldn't care about such a small matter. "I appreciate your help, Matthew," Jamie said. "Please reconsider coming to the reunion. As soon as I found out about it, I knew I had to get in touch. I know they can be a bit awkward and a waste of time, but who knows? Maybe we'll have some fun." The truth of the matter was that Oscar had asked Jamie to persuade his powerful connection to go to the reunion. As Oscar's company was also relatively small, he was looking for a way to climb to the top. He hoped he could forge a relationship with the man who had helped Jamie, and then his own company might be able to form a partnership with the Diamond Group. It was obvious that Jamie's backer was more influential than Oscar had originally believed. And if he could get to know such an important person, then it would be very helpful to the development of his business. Oscar believed a business was only as good as its connections. It didn't matter how good the idea was. Without the right connections, there was little chance of turning it into a success. That was why it was paramount that Oscar got to know Jamie's backer. And using Jamie as a springboard seemed the easiest way for that to happen. Matthew considered Jamie's request, and after much deliberation, he reluctantly agreed. The class reunion was being held in the luxurious hotel owned by the Rodney family, and at 8:30 that evening, Matthew arrived at the Regal Hotel. As Matthew walked through the door, the members of the Rodney family rushed over to welcome him personally. They were aware that their family had been pardoned for their wrongdoings, but that didn't make them any less scared of him, so they wanted to make sure he was treated well. The senior manager, who had been standing behind the desk, strode over and shook Matthew's hand. "Mr. Ford," he said with a smile, "it's so nice to see you. Tell me, are you here for dinner or something else today? If you're here for dinner, we have a private room on the top floor that you can use." The manager continued to smile, and Matthew noticed his teeth were unnaturally white. Matthew waved a hand dismissively. "I'm here to attend a class reunion," he said, rolling his eyes and giving the manager a wry smile. The manager chuckled. "Then please, allow me to arrange for someone to move your gathering upstairs to the private room. The room is spacious, and it has floor-to-ceiling windows. You'll be able to enjoy a 360-degree view of the city while you eat." The manager's smile didn't waver for even a second. He had heard that the Rodney family had offended Matthew, and that they had been forced to beg for his forgiveness. Therefore, the manager was determined to treat Matthew with the utmost respect, for he feared he might end up in a similar situation if he didn't. Matthew smiled back and nodded. "Thank you," he said. "I'd appreciate that. If you could arrange that, I'll meet everyone up there." The manager called for his team to prepare the private room for Matthew's class reunion, and then he told Matthew to let him know if there was anything he needed. Matthew took a leisurely stroll up to the room, and by the time he entered through the glossy black doors, there were already 5 people sitting at the table. One man stood out more than the others. He was seated near the head of the table and was wearing quality clothes that signified wealth. The man lifted his arm and looked at the shiny gold watch that adorned his wrist before casting his gaze to the other people present to see if they had noticed. It was obvious to Matthew that the man was trying to show off. As Matthew peered closer at the man's face, he realized it was Oscar Rodriguez. He chuckled silently to himself and quickly took in the appearance of the other classmates sitting at the table. They too looked well dressed and oozed success. Matthew looked down at his own outfit and wished he had chosen to wear his suit. Although he had many clothes in his closet, and some of them were more expensive, fashion didn't really interest him. As far as he was concerned, a shirt that cost $1,000 looked the same as one that cost $30. A couple of attractive women stood up and walked over to Oscar. They began conversing happily, and little ripples of laughter broke through the monotonous sound of chatter. Matthew was familiar with their methods, and he knew they were only trying to make connections with people they may need to call upon in the future. As Oscar had been the one to arrange the reunion, and everyone could see that he had spared no expense, Matthew knew they were attracted to his financial resources. Matthew slowly strode toward Oscar, and when Oscar looked up, his features temporarily froze. He had hoped nobody would tell Matthew about the event, so he was surprised to see him there. Oscar graciously excused himself from the two women and went to meet Matthew. "Hey, if it isn't Matthew," he said, smirking at him. "How are you? I heard your in-laws went bankrupt." He looked Matthew up and down, delighted to see that he was clearly not as rich as he had been when they had been at school, and Oscar was thrilled about that. He still held some resentment over their past conflict, and he was looking for any reason to feel superior. One of the women who had been talking to Oscar walked over. "Is that really you, Matthew?" she asked, looking at him with wide eyes. "You used to be one of the richest kids in school. What happened?" Matthew peered at the woman and frowned, trying to recall who she was. He ignored their comments and said to the woman, "You look like you're doing rather well for yourself." She laughed. "You have no idea, do you?" she asked. "It's me, Lydia." She put her hands to her chest as she spoke. "I'm a live streamer now. I'm very popular at the moment." She smiled shyly. "But you know how it is in the entertainment industry. You can lose those fans as quickly as you make them." Lydia was happy about how well she was doing, but she knew she was just a small-time live streamer. Her monthly income was good at the moment, but it was very unstable. Matthew smiled, and then he nodded. He wasn't particularly interested in Lydia's career. But a few of his classmates started talking at the same time and making fun of his situation. "Matthew, what kind of attitude do you have toward work?" "Did you know how much Lydia earns per day? It's close to $1,000 a day. That's not a monthly salary, but a daily income." "Do you have any talent?" "We don't receive anywhere near that amount to live on, but we do okay." "I heard Matthew doesn't have a job in Portland yet. He told me that the last time I saw him. Have you found one yet, Matthew?" Lydia looked surprised and disbelieving, but she wasn't actually shocked. "No way," she said. "Matthew, you must be in a really difficult situation right now." His classmates started speaking again. "How come you haven't found a job yet? How long has it been since you graduated?" "It must be quite a while. Did you even go to college after you finished high school?" Matthew didn't care what kind of nonsense his classmates wanted to talk about. They were just a minor irritation to him. "That's tough, Matthew," Oscar said. "Of course, I don't think anyone is trying to make you feel bad on purpose. But you're doing so poorly now, and it must have something to do with you not studying hard at school. He sighed and shook his head. We're all friends, so in the future, maybe we can support you and help you get back on your feet. But his expression was mocking, and it was obvious he wasn't being sincere. Matthew didn't care about what they had to say. He simply found a seat at the table and prepared to sit down. But as he was about to do that, he noticed the looks of disgust on everyone's face. They looked at him like he was trash, and they hated him. A couple of people quickly spoke up. I'm sorry, Matthew, but we've reserved that seat for someone else, one person said. We didn't expect you to be joining us. How about that seat? Someone else added, pointing to the couch. Why don't you sit over there? Matthew's expression grew colder and colder, but he decided not to react. Instead, he walked across the room and sat on the couch. He felt extremely angry. Although he often expected such things, he had never thought his old classmates would go so far. The door suddenly opened, and the general manager walked in. He was holding 2 bottles of expensive wine, and he had an unusually respectful expression on his face. Sorry to bother you, but these 2 bottles are for you, he said. Enjoy getting to know each other again, and I hope you'll remain friends in the future. He casually put his business card on the table along with the 2 bottles of wine, and then he turned to leave. As he walked away, he glanced toward Matthew, and he looked a little surprised. He wondered why Matthew was sitting on a couch that was so far from the table. But it wasn't any of his business, so he didn't pay much attention and just left the room. When the general manager put his card down and immediately left, Oscar was extremely shocked. He knew the manager worked for the Rodney family, and under normal circumstances, the Rodney status in Portland was beyond most people's imaginations. The people at the reunion were ordinary and insignificant, so the Rodneys definitely didn't need to charm them. Oscar knew the manager would be closely linked to the Rodney family, so he didn't understand why he would bring them wine. He was extremely puzzled. As far as he was concerned, he was the only person in the group who had a high status, and the others were barely worth thinking about. They worked as live streamers, senior executives, and in other minor roles, so no one would normally pay them any attention. Oscar was the boss of a company, so he thought he was a little better than his classmates. Everyone looked at Oscar. They knew very well that the wine wasn't a gift for them, so they assumed it was for him. Oscar, you're really good at this, someone said. Since when did the Rodney family suck up to you? What kind of status and identity do you have that we don't know about? Someone else asked. That's right, another man added. If you need anything from me in the future, I'll be available to help you. But let's not waste time talking about it now. Let's try this fancy wine. He flashed a charming smile at Oscar. And then he poured himself a small glass of wine and carefully tasted it. Everyone began to laugh and chat, and they also helped themselves to some of the wine. Matthew was still sitting on the couch, and his expression was frosty as he watched the scene play out. All his classmates were talking and laughing, but Matthew felt as though they hadn't even seen him. They treated him no better than dirt on their shoes. Lydia slowly walked in front of Matthew as she streamed from her phone. She wanted to introduce her viewers to everyone. "Everyone, take a look," she said on the live stream. "This is my old classmate and good friend. So I want you to meet him. He's already getting old, but he still hasn't found a job. What a sad life he has. If you guys give me a donation, I'll give all the money to him. He needs all the help he can get." The audience watching the live stream started to taunt Matthew, but everyone also gave more donations. Matthew felt very embarrassed. He didn't like to show off, but more importantly, he knew there might be a lot of people watching the live stream. If anyone in the audience recognized him, it would cause some unnecessary trouble. But then other comments quickly started appearing at the bottom of the live stream. "That's Matthew Ford. Is Matthew Ford really your classmate? Introduce us to him. Even Phil Dawes has to show respect to Matthew in Portland. You guys are taking a big risk. This live streamer is really brave. She needs to hope for some good luck, as no one can afford to provoke that man." As she read the comments, Lydia's smile faded. "I already know who you are," Lydia said to Matthew. "We're old classmates, so I don't know why people are saying this stuff. We know you're poor, so you're obviously putting on an act for other people. But you can't expect us to really believe it." She paused filming and glared at Matthew. She obviously didn't believe Matthew was the big shot people had mentioned in the comments. And those people obviously didn't know what kind of person Matthew really was. By the time she thought about telling them, the comments section had already started to go crazy. So Lydia knew if she continued to stream, it was very likely something bad would happen. She quickly shut down the live stream before anyone could add any more comments. "Lydia, you can't blame Matthew for this," Oscar said, smiling at her. "This man used to be a rich kid, and although he isn't anymore, he obviously still cares about his reputation. You just need to act like us and pretend to be cool with it." Oscar was the chairman of a successful company, and yet people actually thought Matthew was someone important. He really didn't know what those brainless people were thinking. "Matthew, I know you have your self-respect, but you don't need to hire some fake fans," Lydia said, scowling at him. "What were you thinking? We all know what you're doing, so it only makes us disgusted with you." An icy smile appeared on Matthew's face, and he narrowed his eyes on her. Then he turned his head to the side, deciding to ignore Lydia. The door opened again, and Jamie walked in. When Oscar saw Jamie, he quickly stood up and flashed him a charming smile. Jamie, what took you so long to get here? He asked. I think you need to drink 3 glasses of wine as a forfeit. He turned to the rest of the group. Everyone should hear about Jamie's recent success. His small company has already collaborated with the Diamond Group. And I heard he also knows someone important in Portland. This partnership with the Diamond Group came about because of his relationship with this big shot, and the deal is worth a total of $10 million. Everyone turned to look at Jamie with shock and surprise. Although they had known Jamie had started a business, they had never imagined he would be able to collaborate with the Diamond Group already. The Diamond Group had previously been the Cavill family's company, but everyone had heard there was a lot more money invested in the Diamond Group. It had already spent over $1 billion to buy the Cavill family out. Money might not always mean everything, but sometimes it clearly demonstrates a person's status. The Diamond Group had spent a huge amount of money to save a company that had been on the verge of bankruptcy. So it was obvious its owner was someone wealthy and powerful. But Jamie wasn't paying any attention to people's reactions. He looked around the room and saw Matthew sitting on the couch rather than at the table, and a surprised expression appeared on his face. Jamie's eyes narrowed, and he frowned at his classmates. But just as he was about to speak, he saw Matthew shaking his head slightly. Without saying anything else, Jamie walked over to Matthew and handed him a drink, and then he returned to the table. Everyone started speaking to Jamie. They wanted to get some information about the powerful and wealthy person who had helped him. Jamie, when can you recommend people like us to the important person you know? That's right. You obviously have a good relationship with them. And we're all old friends, so shouldn't we help each other out? I guess this big shot is a complicated character, especially if they're connected to the Diamond Group. I heard that when the Diamond Group was first established, Estelle helped them personally. Jamie looked around at his classmates with a confused expression. He was very shocked and puzzled. He wasn't sure why they thought he knew someone important that they didn't. Matthew was the reason he had collaborated with the Diamond Group. So Jamie didn't understand why they didn't know Matthew was the big shot they were interested in. Jamie frowned and turned his head to look at Matthew. Matthew smiled, but he didn't say anything. And when Jamie saw that, he finally understood what was going on. He cleared his throat and decided to change the subject. It's nice to get together after so long, he said. Is there any wine left in that bottle? Or have you drunk it all? The man who had opened the wine looked a bit disappointed that other people wanted to share it. It's fine, he said begrudgingly. We still have another bottle. Jamie, Before you got here, people were talking about Matthew on Lydia's live stream. They thought he was someone important. Can you imagine that? It sounds like he's hired some fans. Now you're rich. Maybe you can do that too. He laughed. He was there to have fun, and he thought Matthew was an easy target. So he wasn't going to let the opportunity pass him by. A very serious look suddenly appeared on Jamie's face. As far as he was concerned, it was only right that people treated Matthew with a lot of respect. He didn't really know how much power Matthew had at the moment, but he knew just a word from Matthew was enough to make the Diamond Group work with Jamie's small business. That showed he obviously had a lot of influence. But everyone continued mocking Matthew. I bet you can't afford to eat, so you came here with us to get some free food and drinks. And now you're deliberately trying to make out that your status is higher than it actually is. Do you really think you're someone important? As the taunts went on, everyone's expressions became more and more disdainful. Jamie looked extremely unhappy, and he frowned again. Perhaps Matthew didn't care about those remarks, but he did. After all, if it hadn't been for Matthew helping his small business, then his company might have already gone bankrupt. Jamie was the only one who knew how important the deal really was, and he was very grateful to Matthew. He didn't think his classmates had any right to make fun of Matthew, and he didn't think he could allow it to happen. The Diamond Group had given him such a large sum of money because of Matthew's instructions, so he knew Matthew wasn't a nobody. Are you done yet? Jamie asked somberly. He knew his classmates thought joking about Matthew was harmless, and he knew they wouldn't think it had anything to do with Jamie. But when the group saw the look on Jamie's face, they all felt extremely awkward. Even Oscar didn't understand why Jamie would react like that, just because of a loser like Matthew. Although Oscar's expression was very dark, he flashed everyone a smile. Jamie, we were just joking, he said. It's not a big deal, but if you don't like it, let's not talk about it anymore. Okay? Oscar knew Jamie was going to do a major deal with him, so he was thinking about the profit he could make. More importantly, Jamie was now reliant on a powerful backer. So regardless of how small his company was, Oscar knew Jamie could use his connections to destroy him. He didn't dare say anything else. Did you organize this reunion? Jamie asked him. Did you want all our classmates to come? If you did, then why have you isolated Matthew? Do you think he doesn't matter? Maybe you think people don't count if you don't get along with them. Well, I'm not sure I can be your friend anymore, as I don't like what you're doing. so perhaps I should just forget about this meal." Jamie had a fierce look on his face, and he stared at the rest of the group with contempt. "You guys just really love sucking up to people," he continued. "Why haven't I noticed this before? Oscar has been successful for a while, so you all just listen to what he says. And you think Matthew hasn't been doing well, so you've just cast him aside. You just love to look down on people, and you enjoy ganging up on them." "Jamie, you misunderstand," Oscar replied with a smile. "It's just a joke, so it's no big deal." He still didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. Jamie scowled at him, and then he turned to stare at Lydia and laughed. "Do you think you have a lot of fans?" he asked. "You have millions, right? I'm telling you now, this important person you're so interested in is none other than Matthew. The collaboration with the Diamond Group happened because of Matthew's input. You'd better keep a close eye on your live streaming platform, Lydia. Since someone recognized Matthew there, it'll be a miracle if you don't get into trouble because of this. It's quite interesting what you learn when you mess with me, isn't it?" Everyone looked shocked and uncomfortable, and they couldn't believe what they had just heard. The Diamond Group was a large company, and it had made a deal worth $10 million just because Matthew had told them to. He clearly was someone truly powerful and influential. Lydia was more shocked than anyone, and she began to look really worried. When Lydia looked at her phone, she noticed she had a string of missed calls, and they were all from the same number. When she realized the caller was the manager of the company she had signed a contract with, her face turned extremely pale. Quickly, she called her manager back. "Hello," she said. "I'm sorry I missed your call. I was eating. What can I do for you?" She tried to sound surprised to have heard from the manager.
"You don't know how much trouble you've gotten into,"
said the woman on the other side of the phone, clearly angry at Lydia.
"What made you think you should tell Matthew Ford to get a job? Because you're such a fool, you've almost destroyed everything."
Lydia had known the call would be about Matthew, and she regretted acting so impulsively. She had never thought Matthew would have so much power. If she had, she would have been much more cautious. She wondered if the fans commenting on her live stream hadn't been hired by Matthew after all, and then she suddenly remembered she had promised to give Matthew money every time she had received a donation. But Matthew obviously didn't need it. Just as everyone was about to stand up and apologize to Matthew, the door opened and the general manager walked in. He had been waiting behind the door and listening to all the conversations, so he understood what had been going on. His expression was stony, as he walked over to the table and picked up the bottle of wine that had yet to be opened. He lifted it up, and then he deliberately dropped it. Everyone watched as it smashed into pieces on the floor. "Did you think this wine was for all of you to drink?" the manager asked, looking at them with contempt. "This was my way of showing my respect to Mr. Ford. None of you deserve any of it." Without saying anything, Matthew suddenly stood up and walked out of the room. Everyone left behind looked extremely uncomfortable. Lydia felt powerless. She was worried that if she couldn't get Matthew's forgiveness, then she would be sued for breach of contract. If she had known Matthew was so powerful, she wouldn't have dared say anything that would humiliate him. She knew her career was probably ruined. Oscar's expression was even more unpleasant. He had originally thought he was doing pretty well in Portland, especially as he had set up his own business. But he had just realized that, compared to others, he was nothing. He had no power or influence, and he hadn't had any right to talk about Matthew the way he had. Even Phil Dawes was afraid of Matthew. And Oscar knew he was definitely a nobody compared to Phil. After Matthew left the restaurant, he headed home. But as he passed by a narrow alley, he saw a group of young men intimidating a girl and blocking her path. When he looked more closely, he realized the girl was a young woman. She was about 20 years old, but she was very petite, making her look younger. Matthew had already been annoyed, and the scene in front of him only increased his temper, so he had no intention of walking by. Slowly, he approached the group. The young woman was small and pretty, and the man was leaning over her aggressively. "You drank too much," the man said, "but I'll look after you. Why don't you come home with me?" The young woman's face was extremely pale, but she fought back. "What do you want?" she demanded, glaring at the man. "Get away from me right now. Otherwise, you don't know what I might do." Even though the young woman was trapped in a difficult situation, she was able to remain calm and composed, which suggested she might be part of a powerful family. Just as the young men were about to make their move, Matthew approached them from behind. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his tone menacing. One of the young men looked back at Matthew blankly, and then he frowned when he realized the person challenging him was about his age. "Do you know who I am?" he asked with contempt. "Hurry up and get out of here. There aren't many people in this area who don't know my name, and they know better than to mess with me." Matthew glared back at him. "I've no idea who you are," he said, his voice dripping with scorn, and then he stretched out his hand and touched the young man's shoulder. The man's face contorted, and he started to scream with pain. "Let me go," he begged. "If you like this girl, we won't fight with you. We'll just go." The man felt intense pain wash over him, and he gritted his teeth. When the other young men realized what was happening to their friend, they all picked up rocks from the ground, holding them as though they were about to throw them at Matthew. "You're very brave," one of them said. "What makes you feel so confident?" Matthew didn't move or respond. He just waved his hand slightly, and the rocks in the young men's hands suddenly turned into powder. They all looked extremely shocked, and they felt fear start to rise up within them. "Get lost," Matthew said firmly. He kicked the first young man, who ran away with the others quickly following him. They were all terrified by an encounter with such a ruthless person. Matthew turned to the young woman and looked at her more closely. She was around 20 years old, as Matthew had thought. Her skin was very pale, but she was extremely pretty. "You shouldn't walk alone at night," Matthew said. "Are you okay? If you are, hurry up and go home." The young woman was still in shock, and she looked like she wasn't sure what had just happened to her. When Matthew spoke to her, she seemed a little surprised. "Thank you," she said shyly. "Why are you thanking me?" Matthew asked. "Haven't I ruined your good deed?" Matthew's voice was cold, but there was a twinkle in his eye. The young woman stared at him, but she no longer looked as frightened as she had before. Shock flashed across her face, but then it disappeared in the blink of an eye. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "I can see your tail," Matthew replied. "Next time you come out, remember to hide it." "Interesting," the young woman said, and then a wicked smile appeared on her face. Moments later, she turned into a cloud of green smoke and flew away into the distance. Matthew suddenly felt a little nervous. It seemed like Portland was about to undergo some earth-shattering changes, and he wondered if the demon race was already trying to take over. When he thought about that, Matthew grew uneasy. He wasn't sure what was going on, but something just didn't feel right. As he returned to his house, Matthew felt an extremely seductive aura behind him. He turned around with a fierce look on his face, slowly extending his right hand, and a vortex appeared out of thin air. The next moment, a beautiful woman appeared in front of Matthew, and his hand was tightly gripping her throat. "Where is the Avalon tribe?" Matthew asked coldly. "It must be near the mortal world." The woman's expression grew hard, and her body began to emit an even stronger aura. As she stared at Matthew, he noticed how beautiful her eyes were. "What are you talking about?" she asked, flashing him a faint smile. "What kind of tribe do you mean? I don't understand. Aren't you interested in me? Men usually are." Matthew glared at her, and he started exerting the strength and power he had in his fingers. "What are you?" he asked. "You'd better not provoke me. If you do, you'll regret it. Don't say I didn't warn you." As he spoke, the woman began to shrink, and she very quickly turned into a snow-white fox. Even more strangely, she had 3 tails growing out of her back. The fox looked scared, and she sat back on her hind legs and lowered her head. "I didn't know an immortal had descended," the fox said. "You can call me if you need anything. I hope you can forgive me." Matthew looked at the fox with a serious expression. "I don't care what the Avalon tribe is planning," he said. "But it's best not to have any devious thoughts about me. Get away from here. You won't be so lucky next time." The white fox immediately ran away. She was extremely fast and disappeared like a ray of white light. Matthew was curious. He realized the Avalon tribe and the people of the celestial realm were involved in the recent disturbances, and he wondered what exactly was going on and why. But to Matthew, whether it was the people of the celestial realm or the Avalon tribe, it was just something that intrigued him and nothing more. He didn't feel under threat. After all, he knew if he wanted to, he could destroy the ancient tribe with a wave of his hand. But he had some links with the Avalon tribe elders, so he didn't want to act too hastily. Without those connections, the little fox would have been destroyed as soon as she had used her seduction techniques on him. The white fox ran, making sure she was some distance away before she stopped. She held her throat tightly and looked terrified. "What is the princess trying to do?" she muttered to herself. "She almost got me killed." 30 miles away from Portland, an incredibly magnificent building stood in a forest. 2 stone lions had once stood on each side of the building, but they had been turned into foxes carved from white marble. The building was clearly a luxurious mansion, and its owner had incredibly extravagant taste. Little foxes of various colors charged toward the mansion one after another, and as they reached the entrance, they instantly turned into beautiful women. Beyond the entrance, there was a beautifully decorated courtyard with a classical feel to it. A huge tree stood in the middle, and an attractive woman sat under it. She looked very graceful, and she exuded an aura that most ordinary women couldn't achieve. But the woman also had a very shrewd look in her eyes, and if anyone looked closer, they would realize that her eyes were actually bright green and shaped just like a fox's. A moment later, a white fox with 3 tails ran up to the woman's side with a timid and nervous look on her face. The woman raised her eyebrows. "Did you fail?" she asked, frowning. "I assume he hasn't been beaten back to his original form." "Princess Naomi, that man is really formidable," the fox replied, trembling. "He could actually see through my charm. With just a single move, he managed to return me to my original form." "Forget it," Princess Naomi replied. "Of course you're no match for him. I'm afraid even I wouldn't be a match for him. But if I can beg him for help, my sister might be saved." She frowned, looking a little helpless. With a wave of her hand, a green flame suddenly appeared and struck the 3-tailed white fox. The fox's body began to transform, and very quickly it changed into a beautiful young woman. Princess Naomi was in charge of the Avalon tribe, and she was a 9-tailed white fox. Her elder sister had also led the tribe, and she was a 9-tailed red fox. But because the Avalon tribe possessed a lot of valuable treasures, Princess Naomi's sister had been captured and interrogated by the mighty demons. In the current world, humans and demons were everywhere, and they coexisted in the cities. The demons' natural environment had been destroyed, so they no longer had a place to rest. As a result, they had been forced to stay in the mortal world and integrate into human society. They lived among mortal people who couldn't tell the difference. The mortals worked with the demons, were served by them in restaurants, and watched them on television. "But, Princess Naomi, maybe there's something else I should say," the woman added. "The man is so strong that it would be hard to control him. If we really decide to use him, then I'm afraid we'll only bring disaster on ourselves." Princess Naomi sighed. She knew Matthew had a lot of strength, so maybe waiting would be the best option. But the Avalon tribe didn't have the ability to break into the mighty demon's territory. Princess Naomi knew that Matthew might be the only person who could do that, so the tribe had been searching for him for a long time. No matter what, she knew she had to ask Matthew for help using any method necessary. She called over 2 of her people. "Elsa, Tobias, you 2 go and contact Matthew Ford," she said. "You can agree to any conditions he has, as long as the Avalon tribe can fulfill them." "Who is this Matthew?" Tobias asked, brushing some imaginary dust from his white suit. "Princess Naomi ordered us to ask him for help. Since when did the Avalon tribe ever look to outsiders?" He pursed his lips with disapproval, And then he looked at Elsa, who looked stunning in her long red dress. "Does it matter?" Elsa asked helplessly. "Our leader wants us to contact him, so I suggest you just do as you've been told. We can't afford to upset Princess Naomi." If this man really has that much strength, then how can he just hide away in Portland? Tobias asked, clearly still grumpy. I don't think he's genuine. When it comes to it, we need to test him. We don't want him to take the Avalon tribe's treasures and not help us with anything. You need to be more polite when we meet him, Elsa reminded him. If he refuses because of you, what will you say to Princess Naomi? The two of them were already approaching Mountain View Estates. I just don't like the human race, Tobias said, scowling. Everyone thinks they're so high and mighty. He was seriously unhappy at asking Matthew for help. Elsa just shook her head slightly and didn't say anything, even though she thought Tobias was being arrogant. But then again, he did have the right to be arrogant. After all, he was one of the top 10 strongest people in the entire Avalon tribe, so it was only natural he looked down on ordinary humans. The Avalon tribe had existed for a few thousand years, so Tobias didn't think lowly humans could compare to that. Even if they spent a long time cultivating, they would never reach the same level of expertise. Tobias and Elsa's car pulled up outside Mountain View Estates, and they got out. But as they stood in front of the entrance, they noticed several security guards protecting the property. "Who are you?" one of the security guards shouted. "This is private land, so leave right now." A furious expression crossed Tobias's face, and a faint gray flame appeared in his hand as he slowly walked toward the security guards. "You don't need to know who we are," he said, his tone icy. "But I advise you to let us in. Otherwise, you won't be able to bear the consequences." The security guards were angry at being challenged in such a way. They all worked for the Rodney family, so they weren't used to people speaking to them so arrogantly. Elsa frowned and quickly grabbed Tobias's hands. Her eyes lit up with a gray color, and then she stared at the security guards in front of her and smiled. "Guys, I'm sure you can let us in," she said softly. The security guards looked at Elsa in a daze and stood rooted to the ground. "Don't cause trouble," Elsa whispered to Tobias. "This is the human race, not the Avalon tribe." Tobias snorted and just walked in, ignoring the security guards. When the doorbell rang, Mia frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone, so she opened the door cautiously. When she looked out, she saw a man and a woman standing there, and she thought their clothes looked a little unusual. "Can I help you?" she asked, feeling puzzled. She didn't recognize her visitors, and they clearly weren't friends of hers or Matthew's. Matthew was in the bedroom when he suddenly felt two strong demonic energies being released within the house. He responded quickly, going to the front door and standing in front of Mia to protect her. He had a murderous look on his face as he stared at the two people on the doorstep. "Are you from the Avalon tribe?" Matthew asked in surprise. Over the past few days, 3 women from the Avalon tribe had already appeared in front of him, so he wondered what the tribe wanted from him. "Matthew, are these your friends?" Mia asked. Obviously, she wasn't aware of their true identities, but she could feel the killing intent Matthew was exuding. Matthew smiled, and then he gently nudged Mia away from the door. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I'll ask these people what they want." Although Mia was curious, she realized Matthew was unwilling to tell her anything, and she didn't want to ask too much. She glanced at the beautiful woman at the door, and she couldn't help comparing herself with the woman. But she decided to let Matthew handle the situation, so she walked away and left him to it. "Is this the person Princess Naomi is interested in?" Tobias asked, looking Matthew up and down. "He doesn't look like much." Matthew frowned. "Why has the tribe come looking for me?" he asked. "It doesn't matter," the Tobias replied with a shrug. "What's important is that I don't think you have enough strength to be of any use. How did you manage to make Princess Naomi believe otherwise?" "Tobias, shut up," Elsa said, glaring at him. "Have you forgotten what Princess Naomi asked us to do?" "Come on," Tobias said, rolling his eyes. "Princess Naomi asked us to find someone with strength, and this guy isn't even as powerful as me. He's just an ordinary person. So I don't think there's any need to waste our time here. From what you're saying, you want to test my strength," Matthew said. "That's right," Tobias replied. "Dare you accept my challenge? You're just an ordinary person, so what do you have to—" He suddenly broke off because he could already feel a dense killing intent in the air. It surged and spread in all directions, and he was terrified as it swept toward him. Horrified, he realized the killing intent was enough to destroy him right there and then. He couldn't even maintain his human form. Against his will, he turned into a little white fox and trembled as he crawled on the ground. "Mr. Ford, please let Tobias go," Elsa said, breaking into a cold sweat. Although the killing intent wasn't directed at her, she could feel it seeping out of Matthew's body, and she was extremely afraid. A contemptuous look flashed across Matthew's face. "If it wasn't for Emperor Felix, we wouldn't even be considered friends, and all of you would be dead by now." As he spoke, The killing intent that had surrounded him suddenly disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Tobias had gradually returned to his human form. But he was still nervous about fighting with such a terrifying figure. When he was close to Matthew, he could feel the sense of oppression gathering. Elsa took a step forward and said, "Mr. Ford, the Avalon tribe." But before she could finish, Matthew sliced his hand through the air, interrupting her. Then he said, "Enough. I don't care what you want," Matthew said, frowning at Elsa. "Go back home. I have no interest in the Avalon tribe." As far as he was concerned, if they wanted his help, they should be begging him. Based on their behavior so far, he didn't think it would be worth helping them, even if they were extremely apologetic. Elsa looked a little helpless, and she turned to Tobias. "I told you not to be impulsive," she scolded him. "Look at what you've done. Why aren't you apologizing to Mr. Ford?" Tobias realized what he had done, and he immediately looked a little contrite. "I hope you can save the Avalon tribe," he said. "If you agree to it, we'll accept any conditions you have." "Why should I save you?" Matthew asked, folding his arms. "This is my home, so please leave now." If he were to save the Avalon tribe, he wouldn't do it just because two useless people had come to beg him. Even Emperor Felix would still have to be submissive if he met Matthew, so Elsa and Tobias were nothing to him. Elsa looked a little embarrassed. "Mr. Ford, I hope you'll give me a chance to finish what I wanted to say," she said. Matthew frowned. "If you really want my help," he said, "then ask Emperor Felix to come here and pick me up personally." Elsa and Tobias were stunned. The ancient demon clans were probably the only ones who knew about the existence of the Avalon tribe's hierarchy and territory. But Matthew wasn't a demon, so they didn't understand how he knew about it. "Mr. Ford, to tell you the truth, the Avalon tribe's true leaders broke through the void and ascended 1,000 years ago," Elsa said. "Right now, the Avalon tribe is obeying Princess Naomi's orders. She gave us instructions to come here and ask you to help us." As he listened to Elsa's response, Matthew came to a sudden realization. After all, he had known Emperor Felix in the Celestial Realm, and he had heard that the Land of Shadows also had its disciples and powerful followers. "But why should I help you?" Matthew asked. "Give me a reason." When he had been in the Celestial Realm, he had actually been on good terms with Emperor Felix. So he had every intention of helping the Avalon tribe survive. But the people who had come to see him weren't senior members of the tribe, and they didn't know the proper etiquette. So he had decided to tease them. But at that moment, Elsa's phone rang. When she took it out of her pocket and answered the call, her expression grew worried. "We have to go back," she said. "The demons are there." Elsa and Tobias looked at Matthew, hoping he would help them. Matthew knew what they were thinking. Emperor Felix would help me, he murmured. He and I are friends. And since you're in trouble, I won't stand by and do nothing. He took a step forward with Elsa and Tobias. That single step seemed to cross thousands of miles, and the surrounding scenery quickly rotated. When Matthew landed on the ground, he was already close to the Avalon tribe's mansion, and he looked surprised. The aura emanating from the mansion was unusually strong, and he sensed it was under threat. Dozens of silver foxes were scattered on the ground, and beside the old tree, several muscular men surrounded a delicate and pretty young woman. One of the young men was leaning over the young woman, and he had a slightly ferocious look on his face. But he also thought the woman was very beautiful. "Princess Naomi, you'd better not resist," another muscular man shouted. "Hand over what we want, and I'll spare your life. When Kurt, our leader, comes here personally, you won't even have the chance to resist. I've already sent a message to him, so he'll be here in a moment, and then your life really will be in danger." "Why are you still trying to negotiate with her?" one of the other men asked. "We should just do what we came here for." The man was slimmer than the others, and he had a strange smile on his face as he stared right at Princess Naomi. His eyes were very unusual. They were jade green, and his pupils were vertical. From afar, he looked like a voracious snake. Princess Naomi's expression was extremely fierce, and her eyes were filled with determination. She subconsciously gripped the item in her hand tightly. She knew the Avalon tribe was facing such a disaster because of her. If she hadn't been so eager to save her sister, then the demons wouldn't have known where the tribe was located. Many of the tribe's members were dead, wounded, or fleeing, and she was afraid the entire race would be wiped out. Princess Naomi stood up, and a long claw extended from her hand. She forcefully scratched at the muscular man, who seemed to be leading the others. Her body formed a huge silhouette of a nine-tailed fox, and it emitted a dangerous aura. The man's eyes were filled with disdain for her. He had thought Princess Naomi was in a very weak position, so he was surprised she had decided to fight back. And he didn't think she could do anything. But just as he was about to make his move, he noticed blood dripping from his chest, and he realized Princess Naomi had actually unleashed her most powerful strength when she had been on the brink of death. A fierce look crossed his face, and the next moment, he kicked out, and Princess Naomi's body crashed into the huge tree. Blood quickly started to trickle from her mouth, and she turned back into her original form, her eyes filled with despair. "Princess Naomi! Princess Naomi!" Elsa and Tobias shouted. When they saw her in trouble, they felt like they were being stabbed through the heart. Turning into green smoke, they quickly surrounded Princess Naomi. "Let's go," Princess Naomi said weakly. "Do you actually think you can get out of here alive?" the muscular man asked, giving her a sly smile. "You're going to die today, and then the Avalon tribe will become extinct." Although Princess Naomi had injured him, his wounds were superficial, and he was determined to complete his mission. Princess Naomi began to despair. She knew the demons possessed extraordinary skills, and ordinary people couldn't compare to them. She was afraid it really would be the end of the Avalon tribe. But suddenly, a loud voice rang out. "Who says the Avalon tribe is going to be annihilated today?" Matthew asked. "I'm here now, and no one can destroy it." A thick, killing intent suddenly emerged and spread out, blotting out the sky and the sun. Streams of energy formed swords that slowly emerged and cut through the void. Princess Naomi collapsed to the ground, and the muscular man and his team were sent flying. The sword energy surged wildly, and the men were quickly destroyed. Princess Naomi's eyes had turned black, and although they were wide open as she lay on the ground, she appeared to be unconscious. Elsa and Tobias were terrified, and they hadn't expected Matthew to be so powerful. They were about to go over to him and thank him when a voice suddenly boomed out from the void. The sound spread out, and it was so loud it hurt everyone's ears. "Do you know what kind of price you have to pay for ruining our plans?" the voice asked. Matthew turned around and saw a slim man slowly walking toward him. Although the man was small in stature, his muscles were bulging, and his entire body had a light gray metallic luster. An extremely oppressive aura slowly developed around the man's body, and it was obvious to Matthew that the man wasn't human. A thick demonic aura covered the void, and sand and stones flew everywhere. The man was called Kurt, and when he saw what had happened to his men, he was furious. He frowned as he looked at Matthew. "Who are you?" he asked. "You've actually been able to injure some of my followers." Elsa and Tobias both turned extremely pale. Kurt was one of the demon race's major powers, so he naturally had significant strength. Although Matthew could easily defeat a few of Kurt's men, he was taking a big risk by angering Kurt. If he really fought with Kurt, it was hard to tell who would win. Matthew stood with his hands behind his back and a calm expression on his face, barely paying any attention to Kurt. When Kurt noticed Matthew's attitude, his temper began to boil, and sand and stones began to fly around again. It had become clear to him that he and Matthew were a match for each other. Kurt was a great demon who had cultivated for 1,000 years, so he was incredibly powerful. "Did you hear what I said?" Kurt asked Matthew. "I don't care if you're a member of a sect or a rogue cultivator. Our demon race and your human race have always been distinct. Right now, we have internal matters to attend to, and there are still things you don't have the right to interfere with." Although Kurt was extremely angry, he also knew that there were still many powerful beings in the human race. Even a 1,000-year-old demon like him might not be a match for them. He realized the young man in front of him had destroyed his men with a mere wave of his hand, so it was clear he was a genius within the human race. It was impossible for such a talented man to not have a sect supporting him. So most of the human race would be protective of him. Kurt knew if he made a move against Matthew, it would probably lead to unnecessary trouble. Kurt was a mighty demon, but he was concerned about the repercussions of attacking Matthew. If he hadn't been, he felt confident he could have eliminated Matthew a lot earlier. Matthew frowned and looked at Kurt with contempt. Then he laughed and said, "I'm not a disciple of a sect, nor am I a rogue cultivator." Matthew was a noble person from ancient times, and he was the celestial divine lord, so there was no way he could be part of a sect. It was even more impossible for him to be a rogue cultivator. When Kurt realized how arrogant Matthew was, he was infuriated. "You're taking a huge risk speaking to me like that," he said somberly. "How dare you be so arrogant without any support to back you up?" He was feeling more optimistic after learning Matthew wasn't part of a sect. Kurt's form changed into that of a tiger, and then he was suddenly surrounded by a ray of golden light. Sharp blades appeared in his hands, and they were also supported by the metallic light. Everyone started to feel nervous, as they knew no ordinary person could survive such an attack. Elsa was shocked. She had always heard Kurt was a tiger demon who had cultivated for 1,000 years, but seeing it with her own eyes was even more terrifying. The sharp claws emitted a malevolent light as they targeted Matthew's eyes. But when they were around 30 feet away from Matthew, they suddenly stopped, as if an invisible barrier were blocking their way. No matter how hard Kurt tried, he couldn't move any further or extend his claws at all. Matthew smiled contemptuously, and the sword-like energy suddenly emerged again. It slashed at Kurt's claws until blood started to drip from them. Kurt was in tremendous pain, and he grimaced, trying to hold on. He had honed the power of his claws over 1,000 years, and yet the battle seemed to be easy for his opponent. The energy Matthew had used had cut Kurt's flesh, and it had grown obvious how powerful he really was. Kurt gulped with fear, and then he whirled around, intending to flee. Matthew had been perfectly relaxed as he had attacked, and yet he had been able to cause serious injuries. Kurt realized how powerful his opponent was, and he knew that wasn't something he could compete with. Although he had flown into a rage because he had been humiliated, he hadn't reached the point where he wasn't afraid of death. He was instinctively terrified of such a powerful expert. "If you're planning to run," Matthew said, "you'll discover it's not that easy." A number of invisible barriers instantly closed in on Kurt. He tried to fight, but he found he was trapped between the barriers and was unable to escape. He could even feel the heavy pressure from them. Growing desperate, he took out a short blade and held it in his hand. The blade had been formed from the bones of thousands of human cultivators, and it had been very valuable in several destructive battles. When Matthew saw Kurt take out the blade, he looked at him with contempt and said, "Leave now." The proud tiger demon turned into a cloud of mist and flew away gracefully. Everyone was terrified. None of them had ever thought Matthew would have such strength. After Kurt had evaporated, Matthew walked over to Princess Naomi's side. He unleashed a spiritual energy, and Princess Naomi suddenly woke up. "Thank you for saving my life," she said. "But I have no way to repay you." Her voice trailed off, but Matthew just smiled. "There's no need to repay me," he said. His kindness made Princess Naomi feel slightly shy and awkward. "Mr. Ford, my elder sister," Princess Naomi said, and then she trailed off once more. Matthew had just saved her life, so she didn't feel she could ask him for anything else. But Matthew knew what she wanted. "Where is your elder sister?" he asked. "We can go save her now. I owe your tribe and Emperor Felix a favor. This is the right time to pay it back." Princess Naomi led Matthew to the place where the demon race had imprisoned her sister, and some of the Avalon tribe members followed at a distance. Because they were worried, everyone moved extremely quickly. Matthew and Princess Naomi walked through the plains to an extremely secluded place, and then they stopped outside an abandoned building. The ground in front of the building was filled with groups of sword-wielding men. If anyone looked closely at them, it would be obvious that they were all acquired stage warriors. An old man stood in front of the warriors. He had a white beard, and he carried a long sword on his back, which gave him a powerful appearance. His eyes were black, but they inadvertently revealed a lively and energetic glow. Matthew realized the old man must be an expert. Princess Naomi didn't seem worried as she approached him. "Mato," she said. Mato had been Princess Naomi's backup plan. He was part of the Navi tribe, and she had asked him to help if she hadn't been able to secure Matthew's assistance. But she would have paid a high price for Mato's involvement. He was famous in their world, and there were rumors about how magnificent he was. "Princess Naomi, I didn't expect you to come here personally," Mato said, frowning. "Maybe you don't trust an old man like me." Princess Naomi looked a little embarrassed. "That's not possible," she replied, smiling at him. "How could I not trust you? I just didn't expect to have to ask for your help." Mato had a close relationship with the Navi tribe sect master. Although his reputation wasn't as terrifying as the sect masters, Princess Naomi had seen Mato's abilities. Killing demons and eliminating devils was extremely easy for him. He had sword-like energy and wind force at his disposal, which was beyond most people's imaginations. "But the compensation you offered was impressive," Mato said. So how could I have turned down the chance to get involved? It was obvious from his expression how proud and confident he really was. Why don't we just cancel the agreement we have? Princess Naomi asked. Mato's expression turned extremely dark, and he stared at Matthew. Do you think there are other people who are stronger than me? He asked, scowling. Is that the case? How old is this guy? And what skills do you think he has that will enable him to save Princess Alexa? Princess Naomi felt slightly awkward, but she decided not to react impulsively. After all, she couldn't afford to offend him. Princess Naomi, you're already working with the Navi tribe, and will definitely rescue Princess Alexa, Mato said. As for anyone else, I don't think we need them. He glared at Matthew. I think in this case, the first group to step in should finish the task. Besides, this young man can't be anyone important, and if he enters the formation, I'm afraid he'll only be sending himself to his death. It's a waste to give up such a young life when he doesn't need to. Mato assumed Matthew's help must have come at a lower cost than his own. So that must have been the reason the Avalon tribe had chosen Matthew. There was an icy look in Matthew's eyes as he asked, You really don't think I'm important? Matthew was an ancient celestial divine lord, so he was surprised Mato didn't realize he was a lot more important than he appeared. Young man, do you know what realm I have reached? Mato asked, looking down his nose at Matthew. I'm a celestial realm expert. Is this how you treat someone senior to you? He had very close ties with the Navi tribe sect master, so someone junior to him had never looked down on him before. He was sure the Avalon tribe had offered the young man a reasonable reward, but Mato didn't see how he could possibly help. When he saw Matthew's reaction, Mato didn't want to say anything else. He turned his head slightly and looked at Princess Naomi with contempt. Princess Naomi, we've already made a deal, so it's not good business to stop the arrangement before it's complete. If I can't save Princess Alexa, I won't take anything that you promised me. But if I can save her, I expect you to still give me everything we agreed upon. He slowly took out his sword and held it in his hand as he walked confidently toward the formation that covered the abandoned building. Princess Naomi nervously chewed her lip. Mato, do you want us to send some more people with you? She asked. Mato looked back. This is a small issue, so it's not difficult for me, he said. Just wait and see. I'll be right back. As soon as he finished speaking, he took another step forward, and the sword in his hand flew through the sky. Mato still had his hand on the sword, so he flew toward the formation with it. All the members of the Navi tribe looked on proudly, and they all started discussing what had happened. Mato's sword control has improved once again. What a great skill. If I could do that, the demons wouldn't be able to bully me. If you ask me, the Navi tribe is the best sect in the world.
The sword is the master of all weapons, and you don't see that kind of talent every day. Mato could hear the praise from the tribe's followers, and his mouth curled into a smile. He was happy they all thought the Navi tribe was the best in the world, and he was willing to accept their praise. Mato flew with his sword through the endless darkness of the formation, and he wasn't affected by it at all. The Navi tribe members fixed their gazes on Matthew. Several of them looked at him with disdain as they spoke about him. Some people only know how to act like cheats. They don't have any strength, but they still have the nerve to stay here and watch. That's right. How dare they compete with us for treasures and resources? I don't know which sect that young man is from, but I don't think he's even at the acquired stage. Matthew looked at them with contempt, but no one noticed. Using just the Navi tribe's strength, are you able to break this formation? He asked them, raising an eyebrow. He knew no one else could see what was happening in the abandoned building, but he could see it clearly. After all, he was the ancient celestial divine lord, and he clearly understood that he was looking at the top killing formation used by the ancient demon race. Although Matthew didn't think it looked complete, he knew it definitely wasn't something a mere expert could deal with. A few of the Navi tribe disciples looked at each other smugly. They thought they had a lot of skills in that area. Do you know what a celestial realm expert is? One of them asked. Such a person has the ability to move mountains and fill oceans, another added. Watch carefully. A figure slowly flew over to everyone, his expression terrified and a trickle of blood coming from his mouth. The Navi tribe members eventually realized it was Mato, and they couldn't believe he had ended up in such a state. They knew Mato was a powerful expert, so they wondered how powerful his opponent must have been if they had been able to hurt him so badly. Mato lost consciousness for a moment, but then he got up and spat out a mouthful of blood. He turned to Princess Naomi beside him. I'm afraid Princess Alexa is in danger, he said. The aura within this formation is vast. To descend and rescue her, we would need to get past this formation first, and I'm afraid no one will be able to do that. But Princess Naomi had pinned all her hopes on Matthew. She had already witnessed his ability when he had saved her from danger, so she was optimistic. Can you help me? She asked him. Mato looked surprised. Him? He asked incredulously. Princess Naomi, you must be mistaken. Do you really think a young man like this can save Princess Alexa? Even the Navi tribe sect master might not be able to save your sister before she dies. You're just assuming I can't save her, Matthew said with an ominous expression. Of course I am, Mato replied. I've been legendary for a long time, but even I have no way of facing such a grand formation. How can someone as young as you manage to rescue Princess Alexa? Matthew didn't say anything else. He simply stepped into the sky and floated into the void. The atmosphere in the surrounding area became even more dense and murderous. The menacing aura flashed past him, but then it suddenly disappeared. Matthew was floating in the air like an immortal, and his energy alone was many times stronger than Mato's had been. Currently, The Navi tribe was being overpowered by evil energy, and if it attacked forcefully, it would have to use a powerful method to destroy the core of the formation. Only then would it have any chance of success. If anyone became trapped in it, the outcome would become much more complicated. "What a pity," Matthew murmured. "It's actually incomplete." He waved his hand slightly, and the next moment, the formation covering the abandoned building disappeared without a trace. No one knew what had happened. Even some of the demons couldn't understand how Matthew's attack had worked. With just a wave of his hand, and without a trace of energy flowing around, he had been able to destroy a powerful formation. It was possible that it hadn't actually been destroyed, but it had at least dispersed into thin air. No one understood how Matthew had done it, or what kind of abilities he must have. Matthew walked toward Princess Naomi and smiled. "Follow me in," he said. "Your sister is inside." Mato's expression turned glum. "You shouldn't ask Princess Naomi to follow you in," he said icily. "There are a lot of demons in this place. Even if you've destroyed the Grand Formation, those demons will still be able to attack you. Do you think you can face them by yourself?" "I'm not interested in what you think," Matthew replied with a shrug. "So feel free to keep your opinions to yourself." Princess Naomi had witnessed Matthew's skills with her own eyes, so she still had a lot of faith in him, and she didn't hesitate. She called a few of the Avalon tribe disciples to her side and then followed Matthew to the abandoned building. As soon as they entered the building, everyone instantly smelled a strong scent of blood, and they all looked very nervous. They could feel something sticky under their feet with every step they took, and there were traces of blood on the walls. They realized it must have happened when Matthew had destroyed the formation. All he had done was wave his hand, and it had crushed his opponents. They all wondered what kind of person he was and what kind of abilities he possessed. Under Matthew's lead, Princess Naomi quickly reached her elder sister, but she realized the princess was unconscious. Some of the tribe members carried Princess Alexa out of the building, but they all looked very anxious. Almost everyone was in shock. They couldn't believe Matthew had really used such a severe method to turn the situation around, although they also thought his actions had been reasonable. He had been able to save someone with just a slight wave of his hand, and no one could believe something like that was possible. Most of the other Navi tribe members, including Mato, rushed to the scene, and they quickly entered the abandoned building. The level of destruction terrified them, but they couldn't even see any bodies. Everyone who had been in there had been obliterated, and they didn't understand how it could have happened. Mato looked very skeptical. "How is this possible?" he murmured. "How could he do this? Something must be wrong." It wasn't until he had run into the building that he had realized all the mighty demons had been destroyed. Matthew clearly had more strength than Mato had thought. He wondered if he had been too dismissive of him, and if he might have inadvertently looked down on an expert. Matthew walked out of the building. One of the Navi tribe disciples still looked very shocked, but he also felt a little indignant. "You must have some kind of demon technique," he accused Matthew. "Is that because you've joined forces with those demons to attack the Avalon tribe?" Matthew didn't say anything. Instead, He simply walked toward the man who had spoken. "What do you want?" the man asked. "I'm a disciple of the Navi tribe, which is the best tribe in the world." "You're a disciple of the Navi tribe," Matthew repeated. "And you think it's the best tribe in the world?" He sneered as he looked at the man, and then everyone clearly heard the sound of a slap. The Navi tribe member's face turned red, and he looked shocked. He was incredibly surprised that Matthew had actually slapped him. "How dare you hit me?" he exclaimed. As a warrior, he naturally assumed he was superior to Matthew. "You're a disciple of the Navi tribe," Matthew repeated. "And you think it's the best tribe in the world?" He sneered as he looked at the man, and then everyone clearly heard the sound of a slap. The Navi tribe member's face turned red, and he looked shocked. He was incredibly surprised that Matthew had actually slapped him. "How dare you hit me?" he exclaimed. As a warrior, he naturally assumed he was superior to Matthew. Everyone was extremely shocked by what they had witnessed. They all knew the Navi tribe was extremely protective of its own people. If anyone provoked one of them, it was the same as insulting the entire tribe. Matthew had dared attack one of the Navi tribe members, so everyone thought it would cause a huge amount of trouble. But Princess Naomi didn't leap to the Navi tribe's defense. She knew people couldn't insult others who were stronger than them, and Matthew was incredibly strong. His power was terrifying, and he definitely wasn't someone ordinary people could afford to offend. She couldn't believe a lowly Navi tribe member had dared confront someone like him. Matthew knew he was powerful, and that was why he didn't really care about what the man had said. But he was a little frustrated that he had saved the Navi tribe from an unwinnable fight with the demons, and yet one of its members had dared speak to him like that. If the man had just challenged him once, Matthew might have been able to let it go, but he had kept pushing, so Matthew had felt compelled to react. Matthew was very powerful, and he knew if he really made a fuss about it, he could make the entire Navi tribe pay. "Everyone, this man actually dared to hit one of the Navi tribe members," another disciple said, glowering at Matthew. "Let's attack together. I don't believe he can beat us." But his fellow tribe members didn't look so convinced. They had seen Matthew break the demon's terrifying formation, so they didn't think he would be afraid of a group of Navi tribe disciples. When the disciple who had spoken realized no one agreed with him, he looked a little embarrassed and felt resentful toward Matthew. "Okay," he said, still glaring at Matthew. "You'd better wait for me in Portland. Sooner or later, I'll turn the entire city upside down, and I'll also kill all of your family." Matthew's expression turned even darker. He stretched out his right hand and firmly grabbed the man by the neck. Then he exerted a little force through his fingers, and the man's face started to turn red. Mato immediately looked horrified. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Let go of him!" Matthew just glanced at Mato, and then he looked away, not taking any notice of what he had said. He exerted even more force, and the man's face turned even redder, and his eyes started to bulge. If the disciple had been an ordinary person, That kind of power would have killed him a lot earlier. But fortunately for him, he was still a cultivator, which allowed him to survive.
I told you to stop,
Mato snapped.
Didn't you hear me?
Although he had been seriously injured, he emitted an extremely oppressive aura. The sword in his hand trembled slightly, and he looked as though he was ready to kill Matthew if he didn't let go of the disciple. There was a loud thud as Matthew threw the Na'vi tribe member to the ground. The man clutched his neck, and his face contorted with pain. It was obvious he had suffered a serious injury.
I told you to stop,
Mato said.
You did hear me, didn't you? What gave you the right to attack one of our members like that? How dare you attack a member of the Na'vi tribe?
Mato bellowed. There were very few people who dared disrespect Mato in that realm, but the arrogance of the younger man in front of him had caused his fury to boil over. He felt the weight of the sword in his hand, and the urge to use it finally overcame his ability to resist.
I'll teach you not to disrespect me,
he said darkly. He raised the sword and slashed it across the air in front of him. The blade began to glow brightly, and with a swoosh, the powerful energy of the blinding light sped toward Matthew. There was little that could stop the velocity of such a force, but to a celestial divine lord like Matthew, it was an easy task. Matthew simply lifted a hand and used it to stop the beam from reaching him. As soon as the beam touched his hand, it ricocheted off his palm and headed back toward Mato. The light glanced off Mato's shoulder, causing him to stumble backward before falling to the ground. The energy then retracted its path back to the sword, where it immediately disintegrated into a pile of dust. Mato was flabbergasted and couldn't speak. He had never witnessed such strength before. Even if he had started cultivating his powers while in his mother's womb, it would be impossible for him to have such extraordinary strength. He felt winded, and there was a lingering sharp pain in his shoulder. As his shock subsided, his anger began to resurface. He was a senior disciple of the Na'vi tribe, and yet Matthew had dared attack him. Nobody else would even dream of doing such a thing.
You should know that I'm a senior disciple of the Na'vi tribe, and I'm well respected by my master,
Mato said smugly. Matthew laughed mirthlessly. I'm not afraid of you, he said, and I'm also not afraid of your master, no matter how powerful he is.
You should be afraid,
Mato warned him.
My master is very powerful, and now that you've attacked me, you will feel the entire tribe's wrath.
The Na'vi tribe was generally a peaceful clan, and they normally went about their daily activities without bothering with others. But the secret realm was the blessed land of the Na'vi tribe, and it was miles away from the mortal realm. The tribe had millions of talented followers, who were all nurturing their abilities, and they could be found all over the world. If an ordinary person had dared to provoke Mato, then they would have been killed. But since Matthew had been revealed to be a cultivator of immortal strength, Mato felt he would need the support of his tribe to deal with him. That tribe? Matthew asked, his voice dripping with scorn as he looked at the other disciples. He laughed again and said, You've created a huge amount of trouble for yourself and your tribe. To me, you are nothing. The Na'vi tribe doesn't scare me. Matthew slowly walked over to Mato. The dust from the disintegrated sword continued to sparkle on the floor next to him, and Matthew wondered if there was still enough energy pulsing through the granules to cause any damage. He knew the sword's extreme energy would have caused many people to tremble with fear. That was because it had retained a power so fierce that only the Navi tribe knew how to control it. It had even been rumored that the sword had been lost, but that was evidently untrue. Princess Naomi had been watching the events play out in front of her, and a hint of embarrassment made her cheeks flush. She believed that Mato had gone too far with his treatment of Matthew, and as she had been the one to invite Mato along, she feared that if anything happened to him, then her own tribe would end up suffering the consequences. She rushed to Matthew's side and said, "I apologize for Mato's behavior, and I hope you will excuse him." A harsh wind blew across the land, collecting the sword's dust particles. They swirled above everyone's head before being carried off into the distance. As the wind settled, so did the remaining dust particles, which rained down with a force strong enough to create miniature craters. Matthew's expression turned sullen as he addressed Mato. "Remember," he said, "you'll do well not to provoke me. I might not be so forgiving next time." With that, he turned and left. Mato seethed with anger as he watched Matthew walk away. Princess Naomi spoke gently to him and convinced him to return to his tribe. She knew Matthew's strength was terrifying, and it clearly wasn't anything they could compete with. Mato had reluctantly swallowed his anger when Princess Naomi had asked him to return to the Navi tribe, but by the time he got back, he was still furious. Feeling discontent, he went to see his master. When the master of the Navi tribe saw him, he asked, "Mato, what happened to you?" He sounded concerned, and his expression was one of surprise. Although the master knew that Mato wasn't the strongest of his disciples, he had been cultivating his powers for many years, and he was definitely not someone who could be easily injured. Mato looked at the master awkwardly. "I was attacked by a young man," he said. "He was so strong that I almost didn't make it." He cast his eyes to the ground, ashamed to look directly at his master. The master was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Don't worry, Mato. Leave it to me." Even though Mato was only a senior disciple of the Navi tribe, the master still had a lot of respect for him. Mato had been the one to welcome him into the tribe and help him achieve the role of master. Knowing he had his master's support behind him, Mato's spirits began to lift. Instead of returning home as he had originally intended, Matthew decided to visit the Avalon tribe. Suddenly, Princess Naomi's phone rang, and the caller ID told her that it was the master of the Navi tribe. "My disciple Mato selfishly went to help your tribe, and this is the thanks he gets," the master said, clearly unhappy. "You can tell that young man that the Navi tribe will never forgive him for such an insult." Princess Naomi's face turned pale.